Kia ora koutou. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Annette Mortensen, the Manager for Research and Training at Refugees and Survivors New Zealand. Welcome everyone to the 7th webinar of the RAS New Zealand Symposium series, celebrating 25 years of specialist mental health service provision and advocacy for people from refugee backgrounds in New Zealand. Today, we welcome Anjum, Rahman and Professor Paul Spoonley, who will be having a conversation about the challenging topic of racism and discrimination towards people from refugee, religious and ethnic minority backgrounds in New Zealand society. We'll have time at the end for questions and answers. And can you please post your questions in the Q&A box function? I'd like to start by introducing our distinguished guests. Anjum and Paul are well-known activists in the area of diversity and inclusion. Anjum is a human rights activist who has worked tirelessly to support ethnic women in New Zealand and to raise awareness of the human rights issues affecting them. She's a qualified Human Rights Commission facilitator and promotes diversity and inclusion through speaking engagements around the country. And she's also an accountant. Professor Paul Spoonley also needs little introduction. Last year, after 6 years as Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Massey University, he stepped aside to refocus on writing and research in the areas of social change he's passionately interested in. His knowledge of immigration, racism, and race relations, as well as Auckland's diversity, has been much sought after by news media around the world over the past 40 years. A very warm welcome, Anjum and Paul. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Kia ora.
I'm going to start with a question for you, Anjum. With the alarming rise of hate speech on social media, can you start by talking about the work that you're doing to counteract bigotry and discrimination towards Muslim communities in New Zealand?
Thanks. Yeah, so there is quite a bit of an issue with what's happening online, and we've seen that particularly, you know, it's been brought out in the response to COVID, for example, with some real vilification around Chinese communities in around February and March, and then more recently we've seen the rumours and the other kind of racism coming through with Pacifica communities with the second round of COVID. So, and also of course, you know, we're coming to the sentencing of the killer of the Christchurch Mosque attacks, and that was obviously an expression of hatred that I'm sure that there were, I mean, we know that there was significant online activity by this killer, that he was involved in chat groups and had connections online. And what influence that had on his actions, you know, that is yet to be seen. So what we know is these issues are complex, and the solutions also need to be multifaceted, and they need to be collective. And so this is why we started the Inclusive Aotearoa Collective, which isn't just a response for Muslim communities, it's actually a response for all of New Zealand, because we know that while lots of people are doing wonderful work in their own spaces, unless we get together and start tackling these issues across different sectors and across different types of communities, we won't have the impact that we need. So it is a long-term project, and we're starting with developing the strategy, and we've been going out and talking to New Zealanders of all kind with the widest view of diversity, including socio-economic, rural, urban, gender diverse, neurodiverse, all the various and wonderful experiences that people have, and we want to bring those positive and negative experiences of belonging together to develop the strategy, and then use that to build work hubs or constellations where we can get that collective action happening. So yeah, we're at the beginning of that process in terms of that in place.
It sounds like you're out amongst heartland New Zealand, And what responses have you been getting from the groups that you're engaging with?
A lot of responses and some really sad stories, and we have in that process connected with both refugee groups and migrant groups, and so some of it is really topical because of what they're experiencing right now around the for particularly those on work visas, the real uncertainty around their future in New Zealand, and it sadly sounds like there will be a good chunk of those people that will be required to go home. And some of these people have been here for 10 years or more with work visas that have rolled over. They've had children here, they've built their life here. And then with refugee communities, a lot of we've had in one small town, we had some real disturbing stories of them being really targeted by a religious group, and drawn in by gifts and so on. And once they had attended one meeting, a slow process of taking them away from their own community, being given conditional gifts that required them to not go to any religious services of their own previous faith, or to meet with or socialize with those people. And when you're in a very vulnerable situation and you need that support and you feel financially insecure, that was really disturbing.
This is alarming, and I mean, the level of detail that you're talking about is not well known, really, and needs to be exposed.
Yes, but I mean, given that the way we're conducting this research, again, it's not our story to tell, and we didn't want to expose those people.
Yes. Now, it's just started raining really heavily, so I hope that's not coming through the sound, the audio. Okay, so I want to move on to another area of hate speech. And it's clear that we've got a problem with regard to regulating and moderating abhorrent content on social media. For both of you, a question: what more could our and other governments and social media companies be doing to regulate hate speech?
Paul, do you want to start?
No, Anjum, you continue. I'm enjoying listening to you.
No, so that's cool. So what I can tell you of the work that has happened so far. So I know that there's been a paper that's gone to the Minister of Justice around making some changes to law and legislation around hate speech, but no bill has been brought to the House. I haven't seen any bill for that. And we also know that the Films, Videos and Publications Act, there has been a bill put through to put some amendments on that. So that bill is publicly available. It hasn't yet been introduced to the House. So, I mean, that's really frustrating to not get movement, and we'll have to see, everything is now hinging on the election as to whether any of that work goes forward. There's also work I'm involved with around the Christchurch Call, which is an international agreement, and some of this legislative work is the domestic arm of the Christchurch Call. But what we're finding and what you're really up against is, one, there are issues around free speech that needs to be protected, but then there's also the different cultural definitions around what is offensive and what isn't offensive, and how to negotiate those. And so that work is progressing really slowly. I mean, there's been some work done with the tech companies and the Global Internet Forum on Countering Terrorism to ensure that the kind of live streaming videos that were shared last year of the Christchurch Mosque attacks won't be shared again, and that work has been successful. But really the work around how do we tackle the kind of hate that is becoming increasingly common and well coordinated and well funded online, we need a strong approach to that. And I wondered if people would be interested. I just will put up this book that has come out very recently. It's called Shouting Zeros and Ones, and I'll put the link up if you're interested. But there's a range of writers who have submitted chapters to the book, raising issues in the digital space that I think we need to be talking about a lot more.
Yep.
Yes, can I add to that, Annette?
Yes, yes.
Owen Jones talks about online platforms as an opportunity to access information, but as a cesspit of hatred. And I was asked to chair a group looking at hate speech in 2017. And it staggered me once I got into the area how much things had changed, particularly after about 2015 and 16, and the way in which hatred had moved online and what that meant. So I think there are a couple of things I would want to emphasize. Firstly, there is a lot that happens now online, which is sometimes visible and sometimes not. But in terms of targeting particular groups, I think we should recognize that many of us don't understand quite the impact of hate speech online unless you're one of the targeted.
Yeah.
And the second thing is really the way in which international theories, views, politics are now part of New Zealand. And we saw that with the Christchurch shooter. And I would just invite people listening to this to look at some of the new political parties that have emerged during this election and look at their views, particularly around minority ethnic and religious groups. And I think there are two things that are really concerning at the moment, and that is the spike as we head towards an election in terms of Islamophobic commentary and the view held by some that in terms of what we're doing in terms of the sentencing process, that we're, quote, being too kind to Muslims, that in fact it's part of a conspiracy to take over and to impose Sharia law. I mean, the second issue is, of course, the gun laws and the vociferous opposition to gun laws. Hiding behind that is a conspiracy theory. So I think I would like us to educate and regulate. My understanding, going to Anjum's point, is that the minister has delayed these changes to the laws until after the election because of opposition from one of the coalition partners. So I'm hoping that that will come forward as a way of regulating, but that does not preclude, in fact, we should focus on educating. Media literacy, particularly online literacy, much more active monitoring of what's happening, and good on NetSafe and good on the Chief Censor for doing what they do. But we are very naive, and we really should understand the level of hate that is now available online.
Sorry.
Can I just quickly add to what Paul's saying is that the response to online hate and online harm cannot just be online, and it can't just be regulation. And you're very correct there that actually we need to do the work offline and in real life around our relationships to each other, our understandings, and so on, as well as those other things. So sorry to interrupt you there, Annette.
I was just going to say, what kind of traction do you think parties like New Conservatives are getting? And it's noteworthy as well that the sort of line that that party is running is very anti-Indigenous rights as well, in terms of removal of Maori seats and a whole lot of other constitutional processes. Yeah.
Can I begin this one, Anjum? I had a debate with the deputy leader of the New Conservatives, who seemed quite charming. However, some of the New Conservative supporters who turned up rather shocked me in terms of their very direct and what I would call racism. And so there's my concern is that those parties, and including the New Zealand Public Party with Billy Te Kahika, are speaking to a constituency in New Zealand, and part of that speech is both a traditional anti-Semitism and a more contemporary Islamophobic commentary narrative that's running through that. And then it's combined with views that somehow the New Zealand government and the Prime Minister represent or are influenced by Chinese communism. So there's a whole span of arguments which link together dots in a way that is deeply conspiratorial and which expresses a very narrow form and a very exclusive form of nationalism. And I find that deeply worrying.
Yeah. So I want to turn now to the politicisation of migration and refugee resettlement, which we're seeing in the media currently in the lead up to the election, and what you've just spoken about as part of that, with groups like the New Conservatives, and comments that have been made by members of the opposition about, for instance, Baruz Bachani gaining refugee status in New Zealand. Can you both, would you like to comment on that?
Well, what I'll say is this is certainly not anything new. Yeah. In terms of the political rhetoric. So I think the worst, you know, we've had waves of it. So if we look back into the 1970s and that wave of anti-Pacifica rhetoric and the scare tactics used in that election, but literally it goes back well before that into, if you look at some of the cartoons in the early 1900s, you know, in the early 20th century and so on, that the yellow peril and the threat from the Chinese and the, you know, this has been a consistent part of the political sphere, and it's incredibly harmful. So, for example, I do recall 1996 when there was a huge anti-Asian wave of political rhetoric from a political party who I won't publicise, and we were seeing in real life the kind of verbal abuse. Someone I know who had a car driven at her on a pedestrian crossing to threaten her, and those kinds of incidents. That actually that kind of speech has real consequences. And I noticed there's a question on the chat of how do we deal with this? What do we do about it? How do we hold them accountable? And I think that's where organisation, education, and looking at the research around what works. And often what works isn't angrily going in there and refuting them. Giving facts and figures to refute often doesn't work, and especially with the tone. There's great work by organisations like Action Station and the Workshop and so on, and Paul may well have other sources to show what kind of work or what kind of counter speech or counter narratives are useful in trying to pull people back, or sometimes you don't even want to win an argument with someone, you just want to speak to the other people who are listening. But one thing we definitely know is retweeting or sharing to refute someone's argument is often counterproductive. Yeah. And it's better to counter it without sharing and upping the stats and the visibility. Not always the case, but often that's the case.
Can I just speak to that, because I've been involved in long-term monitoring via surveys of New Zealander attitudes. And my best guess is that we've got somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population generally who feel very anxious. And quite often it's a sort of white anxiousness or white fragility around diversity generally. And that might be Maori and mana whenua and tangata whenua issues, or it might be in terms of migration. But when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers, I think that percentage goes up. And I'm guided by the research that your organisation did, Annette, New Zealanders' Perception of Refugees. And when I look at this, it tends to be in that 15 to 20% range that New Zealanders generally feel. There's a group that feel very comfortable with refugees and want to see more, but there's a group of, I think, looking at these figures, between 15 and 20% who feel uncomfortable. And you look at I would be happy for a refugee family to move in next door to me, and 17% saying no. And that's a clear indicator of that degree of uncomfortableness. And what I think happens too is that not only are we not very generous when it comes to refugees per head of population compared with Canada or Australia, that we get very confused about refugees and asylum seekers. So I would go to back to that long-running issue around Ahmed Sawi, and the way in which he was portrayed, and the way in which political parties of various persuasions were not prepared to be generous towards him. And when it comes to Barry's Buchani, I noted that some of the political leader comments about queue jumping, and again, it's that sort of, sometimes it's demonization, but sometimes it's a sort of questioning, and it's a questioning of the process, but it's also a questioning of who this person is in New Zealand. And it just sets up really a form of dog whistle to a particular constituency.
Yeah.
Can I add to that, Paul?
Yeah.
That's such good points. Also, what's happening here, and I believe it's quite deliberate, is a way to try and pit communities against each other so that there is a lack of solidarity between them. And particularly in a situation where you have people who are already marginalised by the system, already marginalised by the institutions and the way that things are set up, and are vulnerable economically. So housing is an issue, getting food is an issue, access to employment is an issue, and all of those things remain unresolved because the people that have the power to resolve them are choosing not to. A way to divert attention from those choices to not address those things is to put up this other group of people and say they're a threat to what little you already have, right? And often you see the rhetoric, which I find really interesting, is, oh, we've got enough homeless people in New Zealand, we need to deal with them, so therefore we can't take any refugees. But if you put to those same people, here are some policies that we can afford to do and we can do around homelessness. Oh no, why should my taxes be used to pay for those lazy bludgers, and they should just get off their butts and work hard? So they don't actually want to solve homelessness. They're not interested in resources being put into that. They're just using that marginalisation to put down another group and give an excuse to not, so it's that deliberate division of groups.
Yes,
that's happening.
And we definitely see that around refugee resettlement and around. And I'll actually get on to that in a minute. But before we go there, I wanted to ask you, Paul, some questions about the role of the media in all of this. And back in 2018, you chaired a group looking at hate speech and what we should do to address this. And that work got derailed by the arrival of the Canadians, whose name I can't remember right now, but
Stephen Molyneux and Lauren Southern.
Yeah. And so that put a damper on the work that you were doing. Can you talk a bit about what the media could be doing in terms of perhaps a more positive role in moderating hate speech? And in that, sorry, and I'm going to quote Anjum, who says, freedom from some takes away from freedom from others. So you're running alongside that debate as well.
Yes, and I always use the Karl Popper statement about extending tolerance to the intolerant means that the intolerant will then, and I can't remember the rest of the quote, but will subdue tolerance. Yeah. So I think we've got to be very clear, and I think our political leadership, our community leadership, and our core institutions like the media play a key role in filtering and moderating some of these debates. I'm very, very keen on fact checking, despite what Anjum said earlier about, bringing statistics to the party. Somebody called it rather like bringing a calculator to a knife fight. But I still think that's important, and it helps all of us put into context what's being said, why it's being said, and the factual accuracy of it. So again, going back to the report that your organisation did, Annette, I noticed that there was a great deal of variance in terms of actually knowing the actual number of refugees we receive each year. So there's some basic fundamental factual inaccuracy. The problem that I have is that the mainstream media that we're talking about that might play a role here is actually more than swamped by what's online, where there is no filter and where you can get information that reinforces your view of the world. And I do want to put this into context, because COVID-19 has increased significantly the anxiety that all of us feel, whether it's around public health and safety, or whether it's about our economic futures, both collectively and individually. And so inevitably, in these moments of crisis, you're going to get people looking at and for alternative explanations. And so our problem is probably not the mainstream media, and I would point to some recent articles. Tina Ngata's piece in I Tangata called Maori Maga, and the Laura O'Connell-Rapira piece in the spin-off, I think, talking to whānau about conspiracies. And some of the work that's been done elsewhere in the media, I think has begun to highlight some of the issues around who's saying what. But for me, the real issue is not the mainstream media, even though I'm critical of it at times. I think it's what happens on online platforms that we have lost control of, and which is now the much more significant influencer.
Yeah. Anjum, any comments on that?
No, I think we've covered it.
Yeah. Just on that note, and I'm going to quote from a paper called Anti-Social Media, which is produced by the Helen Clark Foundation. While New Zealand has several laws in place to protect against the online distribution of harmful and objectionable content, there are significant gaps. These relate both to the regulation of social media companies and their legal obligations to reduce harm on their platforms, and also the extent to which New Zealand laws protect against hate-based speech based on religious beliefs and hate-motivated crimes. So we have got legislative gaps. Do you think the bill that's before Parliament now is going to address those gaps?
So, as I said, the only legislation, and it hasn't been put to the House yet, with the Films, Videos and Publications Act. So the purpose of that bill is to allow the chief censor to act more rapidly. So currently there are certain processes that the chief censor must go through before something can be deemed objectionable. However, with that video of the live streaming of the attacks, that went viral within a few hours. By 24 hours, 1.5 million copies of the video had been shared, and that was still well within the number of hours where the chief censor could act. So that was the main aim. I think one of the concerns, though, about that act is the notion of setting up an internet filter, so which would then filter out content before it was uploaded. And the danger with that is that while we would like to see all these mechanisms in place, if you don't have transparency around those, and if you don't have people that are the victims and the targets of hate being part of the process, then often those kinds of mechanisms are used to hurt vulnerable people more than they are to protect them. For example, if you were to go to the Human Rights Commission and ask them which ethnic group puts in the most complaints about racism, You can guess who it would be. It is Pākehā people.
Mm.
They put in the most number of complaints. And so that is a real concern, because the bill just allows for a filter to be put in place, but all the rules and regulations around the filter will not be in that legislation. And so we need to be very careful around the mechanisms that are being used.
Mm.
Can I add a couple of things, Annette? I mean, you mentioned Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux before. I think we've got a debate which seems a binary debate, free speech versus hate speech. I don't see it as binary in that way. And so the things that I see as being important are the way in which there is harm caused. And it's not easy in terms of identifying what is harmful and what is not. And if I take something like the satire, humour, you know, what constitutes harm in that context is a very difficult thing to establish. But I would add two things very quickly. One is that we fail to slot home the responsibility of online platforms in terms of them being publishers of hate.
Yeah.
So it's very, very difficult, as we've seen, for Twitter or Facebook or any of the others to take full responsibility, and as Anjum said, to then act when something occurs. The second is that whatever we do in New Zealand, of course, the difficulty is that all of these platforms and how they operate are international. So we could do some interesting and I think progressive things, but at the end of the day, it is impossible unless we get international cooperation to act internationally and to then reduce the degree of harm that some of the material online causes.
Yes. Yeah.
And around that, because first of all, these social media companies like to liken themselves as a post office just delivering the message. But the reality, and they know it, is that is not the case, that they curate what you get to see. And out of your friends' posts on Facebook, you'll only get to see 7% of them. And the rest is based on monetization and advertising and their various algorithms and so on. So they're actually interfering with what you get to see. So it isn't just straight publishing. But also interesting in this space is if you've seen the articles from the Wall Street Journal and so on just recently in the last few days around what has been happening with Facebook in India, where they have their community standards and they have their rules, and they refuse to use them, or people within Facebook in India had connections to the ruling political party and used all of those connections to ensure that those rules were not applied to posts that absolutely breached their community standards. And again, it's like, so where is the accountability for that on a global scale? Now, the Indian government will not have any accountability because the party that is ruling has benefited from that. Where is the global accountability? How can the rest of us hold Facebook to account for those kinds of things?
I want to bring us back to the politicisation of refugee resettlement and Anjum, what you were saying in terms of what's happening with some families, both refugee and migrant background around the country in terms of religious pressures, I find very, very disturbing. And I'm raising this next question partly in relation to that, but we've doubled the quota. The border is closed obviously at the moment, but once it opens, we will have 1,500 refugees coming through a year, and we've opened up many new resettlement centres, so Masterton, Levin, Blenheim, Ashburton and Timaru. So my question is, And Paul, you've done huge amounts of work over the years on the integration of newcomers into settlement societies, and particularly looking at Canadian models. How successful do you think it's going to be resettling people in small areas who have little experience of refugee groups settling, but also probably not a huge amount of experience in settling a range of diverse groups, and who have quite a high degree of social problems already? How do you think that's going to play?
So I thought that was addressed to you, Paul.
Yeah, it is addressed to you, Paul.
I was holding silence for you, Anjum. Look, New Zealand's a really interesting case study, because if you look at community understanding and warmth, as the Asia New Zealand Foundation calls it, then the numbers in our community who are welcoming of both immigrants and refugees is actually quite high. And so we're much more like Canada and less like Australia these days, and certainly a world away from Europe. Now, we shouldn't be self-congratulatory on that, because what happens is that there is, as I mentioned before, quite a significant constituency that can make the settlement of these groups really problematic. Because one of the things, and I'm involved in one of the evaluations, one of the best initiatives, I think, is the Welcoming Communities initiative out of Envy. And it's great that we've now got the expansion of that, because I think it brings together the community and the community leadership in a way that invites it to be much more welcoming in a very explicit and proactive way, rather than just letting a refugee community be sent to Ashurst or some other smaller community around New Zealand. I think we've got some wonderful community groups. I mean, Red Cross playing the role that it does in terms of refugee resettlement, just hats off to them. And then I've got some communities, and Ashburton, Ashburton Trust, which holds a lot of money, and decided soon after 2000 that it wanted to be a welcoming community to immigrants and to refugees. And so recently they've held I hope I've got the details right, they've held a public display of refugee and immigrant art in terms of those communities telling their story. So the community has decided, possibly against the wishes of some inside the community, that would be a welcoming community to immigrants and refugees. And I think they've done a very good job. But when I look around New Zealand, I think the response of communities, the action of communities, the way in which particular communities either welcome or don't welcome refugees and asylum seekers varies considerably. But I think there are some wonderful models. And if I can just finish this by saying that I'm a diversity judge, and I've been around doing site visits for this year's Diversity Awards. So I get to see some of the best practice around New Zealand. And there are some communities and some organisations that are doing a wonderful job. And we need to publicise that more, because quite often, I was going to say Anjum and myself, but let me just say myself, quite often I talk about the problems, and we should also be talking about the successes as well. And there have been occasions when, the community has reacted in a very heartwarming way to something that has happened. And you think, wow, I'm not alone in this. There are other people who've been as offended as I have been. The attack in Huntly on somebody wearing a hijab a few years ago, and who then went online to talk about that, and just to see, the positive affirmation and support that was then offered to, in this case, the target of an incident.
Yeah, somebody's just sent through a question about a policy that New Zealand used to run prior to the 1985 change in refugee resettlement policy, which was pepper potting. And started off life as a public health nurse working in South Auckland, and families were being from the Southeast Asian resettlements were being pepper potted throughout South Auckland, deliberately far apart from each other and through the Waikato. And that drove a sort of mass exodus really to Australia. I think we do, the Welcoming Communities program certainly is a really positive program, but small numbers of families in fairly remote centres is going to be quite challenging, I think.
Yeah, so some of the
and actually somebody's just sorry,
Yes.
I'm just reading
West
off
Court
this.
and Wairoa.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
I was going to just mention, so one example from a few years back was when the Syrian refugees were settled in Dunedin.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, not of course, people probably don't know that the Dunedin Muslim community was largely based on students and international students, and there weren't as many settled families there. And the burden that put, especially on the women that were settled in Dunedin, to try and provide support, community support, or for this large number of families that came in. I mean, we could just see the exhaustion on their faces, and they weren't well supported to do that. Again, from talking to people that have been resettled in small town, there are certainly issues around getting access to employment and keeping employment, issues around language, and so on, that excuse me, that are still there, and I feel like the support for settlement is not as strong as it should be. Excuse me, I'm going to have a drink.
Yeah.
But for example, you know, Red Cross having to tender for funding rather than being adequately funded, having to reduce the number of months that they provide support. All of those kinds of things make it really hard for people to settle well.
They do. So Anjum, what given that you know, we've got Muslim groups, I think, going to Masterton. We've got the Syrian groups are going to be going to Masterton, where there's no mosque. What would your advice be to those centres in terms of cultural religious support for the families who are settled there?
Yeah, I think one, to make sure there is some resourcing. You know, these people also, they need a place to pray, to congregate together and pray. So whether, you know, and sometimes, again, talking to Paul's point of the positive stories, we've often seen churches being willing to provide a church hall or something, or some space to allow people to come in from different faiths to come and pray, which is amazing. And that happened to me when I used to work in Aotearoa and live in Hamilton. And the church next door gave me the key to their hall and said, you go in there, you pray anytime. And it was beautiful. I mean, it was so welcoming. So I think, you know, there are those kinds of stories, but like looking at and really assessing what are the needs, the place to pray, finding adequate halal food, who's going to supply that, how's it going to come in? You know, in towns like Whangarei, when we went through there for our project, we didn't realise there's no halal meat supply there. There's no butcher, that people drive to Auckland to get their halal meat, you know. And so, and I know Masterton is reasonably remote, and so thinking about the logistics of what people need, and where they're going to get support from the wider community is really important.
I'm having
Sorry, I just want to say that other faith communities or other ethnic groups will have their own specific requirements. So it's not just that so we're Muslims and we need all this stuff, but, you know, we've talked to people from the Jewish community, and having a safe place to pray and not being attacked or not being harassed. And some of the stories of harassment were quite appalling. I mean, it was eye-opening, and I thought I knew a few things, but yeah. So there is still work that needs to be done around preparing communities and ensuring that they have places to go if something happens and support around them and all of those kinds of things.
Those are some really good suggestions. Yeah. I'm having a conundrum with myself because there are questions coming in, but I've got a few more that I want to ask myself. And so I'm going to turn to Whanganui and what happened there in terms of discussions around refugee resettlement. And we had quite a robust discussion happening between Immigration New Zealand and iwi over whether that should be a resettlement destination or not. And iwi were of the view that they couldn't support refugee resettlement currently coming into that particular tribal domain until their own issues had been sorted out. And some would say not unreasonably. Where do you see that debate heading in New Zealand in terms of, and we've talked about it a bit earlier, about the concerns around resourcing being stretched, and particularly in the area of housing?
Yeah, so Whanganui is quite interesting, and we actually had the largest turnout in Whanganui when we went down there. And so you'll recall that they wanted to put an H in their name, and the amount of vitriol and negativity, not just within the town but across New Zealand around something as small as an H was quite eye-opening. And I think you have to look at the context of the wider racism against Maori. I mean, when you have an organisation set up specifically to attack Maori and to attack their rights, which we have in New Zealand, and the way that they're talked about and the way that narratives around Maori communities run in New Zealand is, quite frankly, incredibly sad. And we often had responses from tangata whenua when we talked to them to say, I left New Zealand and was able to be proud of my identity, whereas I never could be within New Zealand. And that's a sad indictment on us. So then it becomes natural, and it goes back to that point that I talked to before, where these communities are pitted against each other, and whether we can get to a space of advocating instead of this or that, to say, can we do both? Can we advocate, like, can RASNZ advocate for tino rangatiratanga? Can it advocate for the kinds of issues that are really important for Maori? For example, actually having a true partnership within Immigration New Zealand, actually getting to have a say as to who comes into this country or not.
And
like
a consultant, consultancy process.
Beyond consulting. We've had a lot of experience of being consulted and by government, and that is not a nice process. So it's actually empowering. It's about sharing power, and are we ready to do that? And how do we move to that stage? And I would really recommend all communities to engage with the Mātiki Mai report put out by Moana Jackson, the conversations around constitutional reform. There's a project, Aotearoa 2020 Vision, which the iwi chairs are supporting at the moment. We actually need to engage in that space rather than sit back and say, oh, look, they're not welcoming to us. Well, what have we done to learn about them and support them and stand as allies with them as well?
Yes.
I just to add a footnote to that, I think it's one of the vacuums or gaps in New Zealand. So we invested a lot in discussing what biculturalism it should be, and of course it's a process, so it's never going to be complete. But we began that process in the late 1960s. I think that the question of tangata whenua, immigrant, refugee, asylum seeker connections is very unclear. And Anjum has mentioned what might happen with Immigration New Zealand, but I think it's much broader than that.
Oh, yes.
And we don't want to be competitive. And what role should Māori play? Is there a role of manaakitanga? Is there a role of kaitiakitanga, which they can play with regard to immigrants, refugees and asylum seekers? And I really find it very frustrating that we don't have a discussion. These are very localised. You started out with talking about Whanganui, but this is a national discussion and we're not having it. And I just think that's a huge gap in terms
Can I
of...
just say, you know,
Yes.
add to that, Paul, like when you look at the response to the Christchurch Mosque attacks, the very immediate and strongest response was from Ngāi Tahu, and they were incredibly valuable in terms of the work that they did and are continuing to do in that space. So, you know, as you say, I think it's certainly wider than immigration, but it's more than just being kaitiakitanga in terms of, or, you know, manaakitanga in terms of welcoming us. I think we really need to talk about those fundamental issues of how we share power and how our power structures and our constitutional systems are set up that favour a particular cultural view that comes from a continent that is not New Zealand. And I've heard this said in other spaces, so I'm quoting to some extent, but we're an island nation of the Pacific. And we need to start working that way and setting things up that work for us. And it's interesting when you look at the COVID response and hear the Prime Minister say, well, actually, we've got the best response and we've got our response. We don't actually need to look at what overseas people are doing and mimic it. We know how to do our response here for us. And so I think we need to get over that hangover that we have to be wedded to a Westminster system, that we have to be wedded to structures and institutions that don't even serve those countries well, let alone our country.
I'll just move to questions because we're running short of time. This is from Roha Tafaroji. She asks, it's quite long, but I think it's very pertinent. Do you acknowledge that there is an institutional systemic racism in New Zealand? And if so, where do you consider it's more embedded? In the governing system or in the separate policies of different parties? A bigger question, I guess, is how much have you seen critiquing the system rather than just advocating for different identity groups through commissioning with different governments happening in New Zealand?
Yeah, I think that is a great question, and I think it's a really important thing. So last year, the State Services Commission put out a report that reviewed the public service and the way that it was set up. And I think in terms of reading, it's really fascinating reading. And the way that public servants are incentivised and how they're more loyal to their departments than they are to the wider public service, and how they're not actually focused on the service part of public service. All of that is in their report, and it totally mirrored our experiences. And so, absolutely, those structures are really have hampered effective action. So let me just give you a quick example. One of the issues that came through our work was the interaction of people with disabilities with faith communities, and how they wouldn't go to houses of worship because if they went there, people would start praying for their healing.
Yeah.
Or the fact that there was this notion that they were a manifestation of the sin of the parents or of the family, and therefore were excluded from so many things because of a manifestation of sin. And so I felt like, as a person of faith, that it is our job to deal with that, and the burden for dealing with that should not rest with people with disabilities. You know, it's our issue to fix. So then it's like, okay, can we pull in government sectors where there is the disabilities, Office for Disabilities, there's Office for Ethnic Communities, there's the Human Rights Commission and the Disabilities Commissioner and various, like to look at this problem. And the reason I say Office of Ethnic Communities is because they've been working in the interfaith space, because there's no other department that does. So like, to solve complex problems, you actually need different parts of government coming together in different ways, which the way that current structures are set up doesn't encourage that at all. In fact, it's quite difficult. So so to answer your question, yes. It is the systems and structures, and yes, we need to really keep pushing for doing things differently. And I guess that's what we're trying to do within community, with Inclusive Aotearoa Collective, is how can we bring different parts of society together to work on these issues collectively, rather than working within our own identity groups.
Am I allowed to answer, Annie?
You are. You must.
Well, can I just talk generally for a second? In response to the question about systemic racism, absolutely. So we're talking about structural advantage and disadvantage. I think Black Lives Matter is a very interesting moment, and it's going to be interesting to see what it delivers. So it's a moment when we sensitize communities around the world, not simply in America. But what strikes me about Black Lives Matter is that it doesn't necessarily speak to the immigrant or minority ethnic and religious community experiences necessarily. And the other thing is that quite often when we talk about systemic racism, we need to offer hope. We need to be able to say what should happen in a way that allows all of us to move on, rather than creating at times guilt or anxiety, or what D'Angelo calls white fragility.
Yeah.
And I just want to speak to that for a moment, because, you know, some of the ways in which we couch what the issue is, and some of the ways in which we then seek to invite other people to the party, to the discussion, and then to move to to address in some way structural advantage and disadvantage, needs Pākehā in the room. And I've got Rennie Aldo Lodge's book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. So I'm thinking, why don't I write a book saying why I am talking to white people about race as a Pākehā talking to the other Pākehā?
Yeah.
To say that this is an issue that you should be involved with, and you shouldn't take yourself out of the conversation, and you shouldn't feel as though you are being attacked personally, that we need your participation in this, because it's not going to occur if it only involves Maori or the Muslim community. It really does need the people in positions of power and influence to be part of that debate. So I think Black Lives Matter is a wonderful moment of digital activism, when we can see in real time what's happening and begin to mobilize people. But what concerns me most is, how do you then involve those who are in positions of power? How do you begin to address questions of institutional process? And how do you begin to identify what we should be moving towards?
Yeah, that's a very good note to end on. We are running out of time, unfortunately, and we could go on for a very much longer period talking about these issues. I want to thank you, Paul and Anjum, for your insights today and your contribution. It's been absolutely tremendous. Unless we confront it, racism and discrimination will continue in overt and covert ways in our society. I want to acknowledge the work that you're doing, both of you are doing, in representing the agenda for diversity and inclusion, and for being continually at the forefront of these public conversations. It's not easy, and it's absolutely critical at this time. We're incredibly privileged to have had you with us today, and we really appreciate you taking time out of your busy lives. And I want to thank participants also for being with us this afternoon, and to remind you that our next webinar is on Tuesday the 28th at 8 o'clock on the topic of former refugees and asylum seekers in rainbow communities resettlement issues. This is with Eliana Rubishkin and Jack Byrne. And for others who are watching, if you've missed any of the webinars, they are on our website and on YouTube. You just need to go to our RES New Zealand website. So thank you very, very much, and wishing you a very good evening and a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.